Well, hello and welcome to our second episode of Islands at War. I'm Keith Pengelly and with me is Nick Lahuri.
Hi Keith, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Yes, so we had our pilot episode, Nick, and this is where the series, in a way, starts in a serious manner, June 1940. We are, of course, talking about the war in the Channel Islands. This is mainly the bailiwick of Guernsey, which includes Herm, Sark and Alderney. And we may, from time to time, bring Jersey into the conversation if they deserve it, Nick.
Indeed.
Okay. So, as I say, we had our pilot episode, which is, by the time that you will be hearing this, will be up on Mixcloud, Gnet Radio. And, Nick, we have a couple of items carried over from our pilot episode. I know you've done some additional research. First of all, we alluded to the mini Dunkirk.
Yeah, so Operation Ariel, where the troops were brought back from St Malo via Jersey. They were actually brought back by ships from Jersey and also from the UK. There were 30 ships that went from Jersey down to St Malo, and they brought back a fair amount of troops from there, a sizable proportion, but the total is 21,500 were brought back from St Malo.
And these were all stragglers that had engaged with the enemy, or were rear units that were retreating?
They a mixture, really. Stragglers, people that hadn't made it off at Dunkirk, people that were actually based down around St Malo. By the time that the last guys left from there, the Germans were 5 miles away. It's pretty close.
Yes.
They did at least manage to blow up some of the dock facilities there before they left, which meant that caused problems for the Germans for quite some time afterwards.
So a small armada went from Jersey, picked up quite a few troops, went to Jersey, and then evacuated from Jersey back to the UK.
That's correct, yeah. And the yacht club there in Jersey actually has its own ensign. It's the only yacht club that I know which has a battle honour awarded by the Admiralty.
Well, again, this is something that is not, it simmers under the surface of what was known or what is known about the occupation, and it's the very reason we're really sort of seeking to bring this podcast out and to tease out these little sort of nuggets of information. Now, the other thing we looked at, Nick, was the evacuation of Alderney. Alderney was evacuated completely. It was a democratic decision made on the island. There was a sort of putative or titular leader of the Alderney community, Judge French. There was an overwhelming support for complete evacuation. And just tell us how that was affected.
Yes, so it was fairly short notice after that. The British sent 6 ships to evacuate the islanders. There were 1,500 islanders there at the time. I know when we spoke in the pilot, I didn't have the figure exactly to hand and said it was around 3,000, but actually having checked, it was 1,500 people, and they just went lock stock. Apart from George Pope and his family, one of the farmers, everyone went. They emptied out the bank. All of the States of Alderney's money went with them, and they all got on these ships and landed in Weymouth. As many refugees from the Channel Islands did. You can see plaques there in Weymouth to the refugees that arrived from the Channel Islands.
Yes, and I think in the pilot I alluded to the fact that I think on YouTube there is a film made by people, or rather featuring people that remember the evacuation of Alderney, and it's really quite poignant when it came to the mass euthanasia practiced upon pets and animals, and then some people couldn't put their animals down, they just couldn't face it. And I think there's quite a poignant part where they talk about when the ships left the breakwater, the final ship left the breakwater, some of the animals came down, were stood on the breakwater to see people off. Quite how accurate that is, we'll never know. But okay, so those are two items that were carried forward from our pilot episode. In this series, we're being guided by some texts. So those texts are some of the better diaries that were written during the war, and some of the history that's been written after. And Nick is continually, as well as we both are, but certainly Nick is continually burrowing into the archives and teasing out more and more information. But the sources for this week, for this episode, come from the diaries of Reverend Ord, who was a minister on the island, a Methodist minister, and also Ralph Durand. Now, Ralph Durand, Nick, was librarian at the
Prio Library.
Library.
Unfortunately, he actually died before his diary was published in 1946. He died towards the end of 1945, I believe.
Yes, he died of malnutrition. He was his life in itself is very interesting. His war years, and his diary should be approached with a little caution, shouldn't it, Nick?
Yes. For various reasons, to be fair. As with all the diaries, they don't always have the whole picture of what's going on, and
they couldn't hope to have had, really, could they?
No, absolutely. And as I mentioned in the pilot, the Reverend Ord is very good at pointing out when things are just rumours that are going around, and he does update his diary later on. So if he's heard a rumour on one day, a bit later on, and he'll say, I'm a bit not sure about this, and if he does get to the bottom of whether it is in fact just a rumour, he then says and makes a note in his diary to that effect.
Yes, he's far more circumspect than Durand. Durand was one of the many people, and it's human nature, of course. My own father, I remember relating tales. It was really what they wanted to be true, as opposed to what was actually happening. And of course, Ord had more than a slight advantage. He was a fluent German speaker, wasn't he? So when he eventually started to meet ranking German officers, he was able to get a little bit more perspective.
I think he was, as well, because of his position, they spoke perhaps more openly to him about how they felt.
Being a cleric.
Yes, yeah. There was one German I can think of, I can't remember his name right now, who's recorded in the diary, who pops around to visit Reverend Ord on a fairly regular basis just to talk to him, and at some points he's despairing at what is going on.
Yeah, I get the impression as well that many of the officers were chosen to be here on the basis that they were, to a degree, Anglophiles. They were fluent English. They'd studied at university in England in some cases, and we'll sort of get into that as to why the Germans wanted to get into the Channel Islands. But certainly Ord was meeting people who were in the know, as opposed to Durand, who was really picking up his diary entries from information that he'd received just on the street, so to speak.
Absolutely. I mean, there were some of them that had been educated at Oxford and Cambridge, and then gone back to Germany. Very, very fluent English speakers. One of them was actually the censor for part of the time of the war.
Well, of course, that I think it was always Hitler's plan, and we'll get into this, to either invade the UK or find common cause with the UK. And so the occupation here was seen to be different to any occupation in Europe, for example, Belgium, France, Holland, etc. However, we'll move on, and so we've got to the end of the phony war. We've had Dunkirk. We've talked about mini Dunkirk and Jersey, and so really now the war is coming to the Channel Islands. People are more aware of the war, and the fact that the Germans were so close was starting to introduce, Nick, a sense of panic, a sense of fear, a sense of anxiety. Ord talks about, and this is on the 16th of June, Sunday the 16th, a day of prayer for France, and then we're hearing the papers are starting to talk about the fact that the French have capitulated.
Yes, on the 17th of June, Ord records in his diary that the newspapers are saying in their headlines that the French are, basically giving up. They've ceased hostilities. Now, that went on. There was some negotiations after that before the official surrender. But one of the interesting things about the 17th of June, which I mentioned to you the other day, Keith, was how one very important Frenchman came back through the Channel Islands. That was, in fact, General de Gaulle, who had an aircraft was sent for him to Bordeaux by Winston Churchill. There were 3 people on that plane. One of them was General de Gaulle, one was the pilot, and the other was one of Churchill's personal assistants.
So if I could just cut in, de Gaulle we should see here as a military man, not yet a politician.
Correct, yeah. I mean, there might have been times afterwards when Churchill wished he hadn't bothered sending the plane for de Gaulle, I should imagine, with some of his speeches, particularly around the liberation of France, but we won't go there with that. But so de Gaulle's plane came up from Bordeaux over Brittany, and they had to land to refuel, so they landed in Jersey. And de Gaulle was not very happy with the coffee that he was brought. There was a reason for that. It was actually a cup of tea. But he was most annoyed about that. But anyway, they decided whilst the aircraft was being refueled, they would go off some lunch. So they went to the St. Peter's Inn in Jersey, where he had some lunch before reboarding the aircraft. There is actually a plaque in Jersey. I can't remember exactly where it is, but there is a plaque about de Gaulle being there.
So de Gaulle, obviously a very, very important military man. What was his actual stature then, just to get some perspective of his rank and why was he worth getting out?
He was a general, and they needed somebody to basically lead the Free French, and also they were worried about what would happen if French forces went over to the Germans, as indeed the Vichy government did get involved in things like that, but also they needed somebody to pull everything together for France. There were an awful lot of French people, obviously, that had got away from France, and they were forming up various units in the UK. There's another actually interesting story about people coming back through Jersey. There was another Frenchman who came back through Jersey. They were most up at the airport in Jersey. They were most excited to see a biplane, a very, very old biplane, performing some very odd manoeuvres in June, and they wondered what the heck was going on. It flew around for a little bit, very unstable and all over the shop by all accounts. Now, some say that might have been because the gentleman flying it had some maybe fortified his spirits before he left France.
Drink may have been taken.
Yeah. Now there's no evidence of that, but they were very surprised when it landed, and they found a man in his 50s who'd actually last flown an aircraft during the First World War, but he'd found this plane as France was falling, and decided that he wanted to make a run for it. He'd actually thought he would ditch near a ship, because on the basis that any ships around that part of the French coast would actually be British ships, and maybe they'd pick him up. But then he saw Jersey and thought he'd have a go at landing there. So yeah, they were very surprised when he arrived. Just another one of those little snippets.
Yeah, one of these little things that really sort of bring out the humanity when these great events are happening. The world is shifting, world affairs are shifting, and of course that shift comes towards Guernsey, and I want to look, Nick, at some of the changes that started to occur in public life. I mean, talk about cinema closures, for example.
Yeah, because they didn't know what was going on. There was, as you say, a bit of panic going on. There were various measures that were introduced to try and calm people down, but I think actually stop them meeting up quite so much, because if they were going out and socialising, that's how the rumours were spreading.
Exactly. It's like a virus.
Indeed. I'm not sure how effective that was, because numerous accounts that I've read talk about people meeting up at various other places anyway, just because they were all worried. So, for example, down at Bordeaux, there was often large gatherings of the people that lived around the Bordeaux area.
Just for listeners, Bordeaux is it's in the north of the island, and it's a bay. It's at sea level, obviously, and it's a sort of quite nice area. It's just away from the bridge, one of the villages in the north of the island.
Yeah. So sorry, that could be very confusing for listeners that are not familiar with the island when they're wondering why the heck I'm talking about Bordeaux. Many accounts I've seen that talk about people would meet up down at the sea wall just to talk and see what they really gauge what other people were thinking. What are you going to do? Are you going to try and get away? Are you going to stay here? Are the Germans even going to come? And there were a large number of them that were fairly convinced that the Germans would just stop at the French coast. Yeah,
in fact, one of the books that came out in the 50s, Frank Strubant's book, which was one of the books I first read way back in the 60s, he talks about, as a young man, relaxing on a beach and in the north of the island, and I suspect it could have been Bordeaux Beach, certainly around that area, and seeing the massive plumes of smoke coming up from the Cherbourg area, even visible from Guernsey, and the war in France was in a way was visible, wasn't it? It was visible from here, and it was audible.
Yeah, they could certainly hear when there was bombing going on, and other explosions, artillery, naval ships attack, trying to protect the retreating forces effectively. They could hear all of that from here, and if there was gunfire going on at night, they could see the flashes of that, as likewise the flashes of explosions and things like that, or fires in France.
As I say, we continue to talk about the changes to public life, blackout regulations.
Yes, so blackout regulations were already in place, but they were enforced more strictly, shall we say, as they'd been imposed similar to the UK, but they were being more rigidly enforced. I've got the air raid warden's logbook. I've got copies of that from the archives, and it makes quite interesting reading. You see that there are entries that so and so phoned up. There's a light on a house at wherever, and the air raid warden will go around. But also they note a lot of aircraft movements around the islands. So that if they see French aircraft, and they try and log the types where they can see, but often they're too far away. So they make for quite interesting reading. Quite a lot of the ones that phone up are usually ex-military people, because it's usually Major so and so has phoned up to say there's an exposed light at a house at Cherbourg or something like that.
Shades of Dad's Army, perhaps.
It is. Well, I think perhaps they were being a little bit more vigilant than some others.
Okay, so we also now one of the things I've turned up, or that is alluded to in Ralph Duran's diary, is this a secret session of the Royal Court. The Royal Court, which should explain as a Guernsey court. It was the British government was seriously debating whether to actually arm and protect the Channel Islands. Was this ever going to happen?
Well, you'd be surprised. It was off on. I've read the War Cabinet papers, and they sometimes change their minds in 3 days. We talked about that in the pilot episode, but sometimes they change their mind. Sorry, in 3 times in 1 day, not 3 days. The debate went on for a couple of weeks as to what they were going to do about the Channel Islands. 1 minute they were going to send a battalion to come and defend us, to reinforce those forces that were here. There were only about 600 personnel across all the islands at that time. And then by lunchtime, they thought, we'll send a smaller force across. And then by the time they got to the end of the day, their next meeting, they was like, no, this is a bit pointless. It's interesting because they'd all, as far back as 1925, the Channel Islands had been identified by the British military as not being of any strategic military importance to Britain, and only likely to be of strategic importance to France in the event of war, which was quite interesting that they were worried about the French rather than anything else. So it's a bit strange that was brought up right at the start of when they were talking in War Cabinet about whether to defend the islands or not. Yet they still carried on. I think there was just a lot of political pressure. People like Lord Portsea, who was actually a member of the House of Lords from Jersey, who was creating quite a lot of noise, shall we say it, in the House of Lords, and also in the newspapers about his feelings about what should happen. But they just looked at it and then finally, thankfully, realised that there was absolutely no point in trying to defend the islands. It was just far too difficult. The Germans, if they made it to the French coast, would just be able to take off, come and drop bombs back to France, within an hour round trip, refuel. 30 minutes later they could be coming back again. So it was just completely pointless. The civilian population would have been devastated.
Yes, but we should remember that in the First World War there was a French anti-submarine squadron based certainly in St. Petersburg that went on to win the Croix de Guerre. So there was sort of some rationale, if you like, for having not only military stationed here, but active military.
Oh,
if I can put it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, Coastal Command had aircraft based here, in the run up to the occupation of the islands till the islands were demilitarised. They had various aircraft that were based there. The islands were used for a bombing raid against Italy. Albeit they didn't start their trip from here, they refuelled here and took off to go to bomb Italy, although they inadvertently hit some bits of...
This is much later in the war, of course.
No, this is June.
Okay.
June. Yeah, no, this is the British sent a force over to go and bomb Italy, pretty much as soon as Italy became involved in things.
Right. Okay. We talked about demilitarisation. We know here there was a military installation commonly known to us as Fort George, and the Germans took over that. But in the lead up to and during the demilitarisation, just talk us through this. So there was British Army personnel based at Fort George, and what was the sort of process and timetable for demilitarisation?
They went pretty much in one day.
Really, just like that?
Yeah.
So how many? What was the sort of size of the force in the lead up to this final exit?
I think it was around 600 personnel across all of the islands. There was a machine gun a unit up in Alderney, which was primarily there for training, actually, because it was a convenient place for them to train. There were various personnel in both Jersey and Guernsey. As you alluded to, the army were based up at Fort George, which was also the home of the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry. The Royal Guernsey Militia.
Yeah,
Again, you mustn't get those mixed up as well. But once the British decided to demilitarise, as you said, there was this secret meeting with the States, with Louis Guillemette relaying on the telephone what was going on to both ends, the British government and... once they decided to demilitarise, they packed up and they were out of here pretty much in a day. There was a chap who was the signalman at the White Rock, which is the harbour in St. Petersburg, who the first thing he knew about it was he just saw them all go. And that in an interview with a UK newspaper, he said, they were gone in a day.
Yes, and you mentioned Louis Guillemette there, Nick. Louis Guillemette, for listeners, was a very senior civil servant and went on to become, under the German military occupation, the Guernsey government was truncated right down to a controlling committee, Nick? Yep.
That's correct, yeah.
And Louis Guillemette was the sort of liaison. He wrote some really interesting diaries, and we will get to them. They come on stream in early 1941.
Yes.
We had we've talked about this speech given by Deputy John Leal, a very, very senior member of the Guernsey government. He made the speech on the 22nd of June. Now, this is quite pivotal, this, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was actually the president of the States of Guernsey, a very senior man. And he was really trying to prevent people from leaving. Not prevent. He was trying to encourage people to stay. What they were concerned about, what the States of Guernsey were concerned about, was if too many people went, then the island just couldn't keep running. So, it would cause massive problems immediately. And in fact, the number of people that went did cause big problems, because despite the fact there were a lot of things to be done, there were a lot of people who effectively became unemployed because they were doing jobs for people that were no longer here and no longer operating. Yet there were jobs that needed to be filled. And
so we're talking
mismatch.
about like business owners leaving their businesses, just cutting and running.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll talk about statistically how many people went, but also that's a very good point. Businesses having, employees having no employer. We also we should acknowledge just the sheer amount of people that went and joined up. And for example, my grandfather, who left the Royal Navy in 1938, he was called up in 1939. So he had gone. So you had people that were on the reserve, but then you had young men and women that wished to join the Royal Forces. And I think you said across the Channel Islands it was about
10,500 during the course of the war. There were about 10,500 service personnel. That of course doesn't take into account all of the people that left from the Channel Islands and then went to work in munitions factories and other important war work. Those aren't included in the numbers. Those are just the people that served in military roles.
And it should be explained to listeners that following the losses of manpower in the First World War, there was no particular pressure, apart from the love of one's country, for Channel Islanders to go and join up and fight what was obviously a shooting war. So 10,500 people was a staggering amount for what was the joint. What was
about 100,000?
100,000 people. So you got 10% of the population actually went to fight. It's really quite incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is as well. By the time we get to June 1940. Most of the men of military age had already gone. Some of them long gone. I mean, my dad's father had gone early 1940, I think it was. My mum's father was already in the Navy. He'd joined up for boy service and had been in the Navy for a number of years by that point.
Well, Grandad had joined up in 15 and come out and time served by 1938, but he was back by 1939. So all of this is now really running at quite a pace. The island life is now beating to this war drum. There was a batch of school children that left. Reading Durand about it, there's about 5,000 school children.
Yep.
This is just leaving Guernsey, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, there's an interesting, and you've seen the notebook. I've shown it to you. This family diary. It's not. It was a book that kept in dates of funerals and marriages, and it goes back into the 19th century. And there's an entry in my grandmother's writing to say, "Poor Nellie was killed today." And this was the 21st of June 1940, and I thought, well, I don't remember anybody called Nellie in the family. And then in the next day, the 22nd of June, there is a entry made by my great-grandmother, to state that, and she names very many of the members of the family, to say that today we were going to go to England, but that fellow Langmead stopped us. And I discussed this with you because we both know that Langmead was a very, very senior police officer, detective, plainclothes policeman, number 3 or something like that. Very, very senior. And he told the family that they couldn't be evacuated. And one of the things that I wanted to get into, and it's still a lead I'm trying to follow up on, is why was my family prevented from going? But then the Channel Islands Occupation Society newsletter number 67 from April 2023, there's Phil Martin has written a piece about Wimmera College that was a seminary, a Catholic school here, Nick.
Yeah.
He wrote this piece that it was decided that on the 21st of June, the staff and pupils were advised that evacuation of the college would take place the next day, and the ship left Guernsey for Weymouth, together with other school children and those that had decided to leave the island. So it looks very much to me, Nick, as if the reason my family were bumped up is because the college itself, and I'm not making judgment about this, is just a fact, that the this Catholic school was college brethren and the pupils were evacuated en masse, and so a decision was made one day, and within 24 hours they were gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening to this and thinking, where is Wimmera? It doesn't exist anymore, but the site does.
It's for local people. It's the Pierre Park.
Yeah, absolutely. It's some Pierre Park Hotel. There are a couple of little bits of it left if you wander around the St Pierre Park grounds just below their golf.
Down in the valley.
Yeah, down in the valley just below their golf course. There's some steps that are left there, and a tiny little bit of wall there as well. But that's all that remains of the former Wimmera College. But yeah, the priority right from the start was to get the children away to safety in the UK.
And when you think, Nick, these ships were going off across the channel with women and children on board, and U-boats would have been in the channel at that stage?
Yeah, quite possibly. Why? They could have had the risk of being torpedoed. They were certainly worried about air attacks. I've seen accounts from people that were on those ships that were evacuated, where they, as soon as an aircraft appeared in the sky, they were immediately worried that it was going to be a German aircraft and it might strafe their boat or even worse, bomb it. It was. And these people were fairly well crammed onto these boats. There wasn't,
and these ships were armed. In fact, we'll see that certainly the last boat that left got some shots away when we talk about the raid.
Yeah, sure. Armed is probably being a bit generous. A single Lewis gun here and there.
It shows intent.
Indeed. Well, it's better than nothing, I suppose.
yeah, but people start firing back. Yeah. But we'll get onto that. But also, again, lots and lots of very, very accelerated social change. People marrying.
Yeah, absolutely. People were getting married at the drop of a hat, particularly if one of them was going to be staying here and their spouse was leaving to go to join the forces. I have heard that there were cases of later marriages being annulled because they hadn't seen them for a couple of years. So whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I have seen reference to that. In fact, somebody very kindly sent me something the other day along those lines.
Yeah, and then one of the things, I'm backtracking slightly now, we for two reasons. One, we talked about the evacuation of Alderney and the evacuation of Guernsey, where it came to pets. There was a huge euthanasia program, and in fact, I mentioned just earlier that my gran had alluded to Nellie. It was only through careful reading of this book I found out that Nellie was her dog, and because they thought they were going to be evacuated to the UK, they had their dog put down.
Yeah, a lot of people did.
I think I read somewhere that vets and veterinary assistants working around the clock putting poor cats and dogs down.
They were, unfortunately, because people couldn't take them with them. They were only allowed to take one case each of limited dimensions. If you've ever been down to Liberation Day parade in St. Peter Port, you'll have seen that there's various vehicles that drive around and whatever. There's a couple that have are sort of done up as people going down to the boat with their children to be evacuated with the cases on the back and labels. So you can see that it was a very small suitcase, and what we'd probably class as an overnight bag these days were certainly something that you could take on the plane rather than having to check it in if you were flying somewhere.
Yeah, my granddad initially, before the family tried to get away, my father was at St. Martin's School with his coat and his bag and his label around his neck saying who he was, and grandmother changed her mind and went and fetched him home. So he was never evacuated. Okay, so we've also refugees are still arriving here from France.
Yeah, they were actually, and some of them civilians that got away from the French coast, but more often than not, it was military personnel that came through here. There was 17 Squadron, which was a Hurricane Squadron of the RAF, where there's a great account actually in the Imperial War Museum archives of a chap called Harold Bird Wilson, who recounted he actually had quite a nice time in this very few days in Guernsey. He stayed at the Manor Hotel, which was being used by the RAF anyway for personnel at the airport.
Later used by the Luftwaffe.
It was indeed, purely because it was right next to the airport, really.
And just remind people, when was our airport built and finished?
It was finished late in 1939, I believe.
Absolutely perfect timing for the Luftwaffe. But yeah, so we've still got this sort of refugees arriving, British military still sort of kicking around in a sort of disorganised fashion. Now the King's message. The King apparently recorded a message, and it was never published.
There was certainly a written message to the Channel Islands, which never got published, just because the way time moved on, everything was changing so rapidly. There are copies of it that were printed. I don't know why it was never distributed. It didn't appear in the Guernsey papers. Potentially because things were just moving so quickly.
Okay, and then the last few stragglers were starting to get off the island. Someone called Patriot. He was an author of some posters, "Don't Be Yellow" posters.
Yeah, he wasn't the only one actually. There was a lot of confusion and, as you mentioned earlier, a bit of panic as well. In fact, there was a massive uptick in car accidents because people were herring around the island to get to the boats, and lots of people were involved in accidents. But the posters said things. I've got one here on my phone that I took a picture of the other day. Why go mad? Compulsory evacuation is a lie. There's no place like home. Cheer up. And that was actually from the Banks Brewery and Co. Limited. But there were posters from this Patriot, who then himself disappeared off the island before the Germans arrived.
Yes,
we'll gloss over that bit.
Yeah. Can we put this up on our Facebook page?
Yeah, absolutely.
There is an Islands at War Facebook page. Also, if you've got any questions or comments to make, be gentle on this. You can get hold of us, Nick and I, at occupied@gnetradio.com. Right, Nick, you've got we're going to finish up in a few minutes, but let's just talk about how the famous or infamous raid on the 28th of June, how it came to take place, and then we'll sort of go into that in the July episode. But really, just how did the Germans come to see the vehicles on the quay, and what was the misconception?
Yeah, sure. There'd been a lot of reconnaissance flights in the week in the run-up to that, German aircraft coming over. They were trying to work out what was going on. Didn't know the islands had been demilitarised because it hadn't been announced, other than in the islands. So they saw these lorries and things down there. So 6 Heinkel 111s were sent from France and came over on the 28th of June and bombed both Guernsey and Jersey. Unfortunately, people crawled under the tomato trucks to try and shield themselves, and a lot of them died there. 34 were killed, and they either died during the course of the raid, or some died a little bit later in hospital. And numbers talk about 33 injured. I've seen varying numbers about how many people were injured, because some people just didn't actually go and seek proper medical treatment. It was all very, very confused about what was going on.
Okay, so what we're going to do is not to downplay the raid, but we'll talk about the aftermath of the raid as it opens up our July episode, which will be one fortnight after this episode of June 1940. It just leaves me to thank Nick, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you in July, Nick, won't we?
Indeed. See you in July.